Our story begins in Haringey, London, in 1928. The voting age of women had just been lowered from 30 to 21, giving them equal suffrage to men, so yay! Equality. As for famous people being born, the legendary composer who wrote Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head, which was famously sang for Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, great film, Burt Bacharach was born, as was the astronaut Tim Lovell, who of course was, I think he was played by Tom Hanks in Apollo 13. And, they had just been born, as had a legendary Formula One designer, founder, and businessman. I'm of course talking about Lotus founder Anthony Colin Bruce Chapman, who was simply called Colin. So Colin Chapman grew up in Haringey, as I said. His dad ran a pub then called the Railway Hotel, which is now known as the Funky Brown's Shisha Lounge and Restaurant. So Chapman went to the Stationers' School in London, in the Stationers' Company School near Tottenham Lane. It was in the 1940s that Lotus began, but to find out about Chapman's genius, we must go back to the mid-40s, as Chapman had studied structural engineering in London and was in the RAF for a short time. Eventually, he joined British Aluminium. He was trying to make enough money to fund his racing passion because he loved motor racing. I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory, really. I mean, people forget this, but he was actually a driver when he was younger. Now it's 1948, enter Hazel Williams. So Colin's 20, Hazel's 21, they are boyfriend and girlfriend. And he affectionately called her Lotus Blossom, apparently, which may have been the reason why he created the name Lotus. Hazel lived on Alexander Park Road. Williams, later Chapman of course, because they got married and were married for many years, gave Chapman money and allowed him to use her family's lockup so he could work with engines. Colin and his friends started making Lotus's cars behind his dad's pub where there were stables. They started by modifying Austin 7s, calling them the Lotus Mark I, and eventually the business grew. Plus Chapman was a decent driver and won a few races with the Mark I. They made enough money to expand the workshop and now had a proper headquarters. During this time, Chapman's best known characteristic had begun to develop as he sought to make his cars quicker while keeping in the rules or even exploiting loopholes, and he found many ways to do this. Chapman supposedly once said, and I quote, "Rules are for the obedience of fools and interpretations of smart men." If he did say this would follow a lot of his later designs, this idea of finding loopholes, and rules are to be interpreted by clever fellas, and fools follow them and don't think about them and try and find ways to exploit them. I was never really good at STEM in school. I mean, I got a B in applications and maths, or was it an A? I don't remember, honestly. Anyway, I'll just copy exactly what the Wikipedia says here, because honestly, I have no clue what any of this means. Around this time, Chapman began to show his ability to think of ways to become more competitive while remaining within the rules. One early car had a 6-port head with 4 exhausts and 2 inlet ports. Chapman realized that better flow characteristics, and therefore more power, could be achieved with an 8-port head, but lacking the resources to have one made, he reversed the port functions and de-Siamesed the old inlet ports, with appropriate manifolds, not to be confused with the YouTuber Jack manifold, and a new camshaft. I think it says camshaft, I don't know. His engine outclassed the opposition until the rules were changed to outlaw the specific changes he had made. Whatever the hell that means. Anyway, basically the idea is that Chapman had already started exploiting the loopholes in the regulations and coming up with ideas to make his car quicker. And this was something that you would see a lot in Formula One, as we will get into later on. The next few marks went by, not to be confused with German currency, and they sold quite well. Especially the 7, which is still made today by Caterham. Do you guys remember Caterham? I'm hoping and praying you guys do, because they were special. They were special. Anyway, in 1954, Lotus created a racing division with the idea of eventually entering Formula One. Chapman then entered more racing events, and he even attempted to enter a Formula One race in 1956 in France, where he even outqualified future world champion teammate Mike Hawthorne, but in final practice he shunted into Hawthorne, and thus his racing career at a high level was now over. He did the odd race now and then, which was how he discovered his greatest ever driver, Jim Clark, as in a race at Brands Hatch, Chapman raced against Clark and noticed how talented he was and signed him up to his team. Which is which, I mean, we'll get into Jim Clark later on, how incredible he was. And if you want to go and check out another one of my videos on Jim Clark, go and check that out. I'm considering making another one on him, which is a lot more edited, such as the video you're watching right now, because my editing has improved a lot recently. Because I've discovered driving passion again, which is good. Anyway, now it's 1958, Lotus have the funds to enter Formula One, and Chapman had already created the Lotus 11, which was a sports car successfully driven at junior levels and in other categories by Cliff Allison. Then the Lotus 12 was created. It was a single-seater car designed for Formula One. Allison was hired to drive, and Chapman selected mechanic Graham Hill to drive alongside. Hill was the first in a long line of legendary drivers to have gotten their big break with Lotus under Colin Chapman's leadership. The first Lotus car was not particularly quick, with a 4th in Belgium, 6th places in Monaco and the Netherlands, 7th in Italy, and 10th in Morocco and Britain with Allison. Hill wasn't so fortunate, with 6 mechanical blow-ups in 1 spin, plus a 6th and 16th in Italy and Morocco. The 12th successor, which Hill drove to 6th and 16th in 1958, was called the 16. I don't know why they skipped 13, 14, 15, but we move. Another driver was hired in 1959 called Innes McGregor Ireland, who had been very, very successful in sports cars. Performances did improve, as did reliability, thanks to the addition of Keith Duckworth. Other personnel involved during this time included the Costin brothers, Frank and Mike. And we will get into Duckworth and Mike Costin later on, because those two are utter legends. The 16 was quicker with more points coming in 1959. However, it would be the 18, the Lotus 18, again I don't know why they skipped 17, that would begin the upward trajectory of Lotus Formula One Team, Team Lotus. The car was ridiculously light, and Lotus would have their first fatality in their vehicles in Belgium that year, with Alan Stacey. 1960 in general was a very good year for the team despite this. They would take podiums with Ireland, and 2 young rookies called John Surtees, who was a motorbike champion, and Jim Clark would debut with the team. I wonder how those two would do in F1. They also had another entry apart from their own factory team, as Rob Walker Racing Team with the legendary Stirling Moss drove a Lotus 18, and Moss took the first win for Lotus in Monaco and also won it in the USA that year. Ireland scored second in the Netherlands and in America, and as a result, Lotus scored a 1-2 finish for the first time in the US Grand Prix in 1960. As well as these second place finishes, Ireland also scored 3rd in Britain and 2 6th place finishes. Clark scored a 3rd in Portugal, and John Surtees scored a 2nd at the British Grand Prix, their home track. Due to these results, the small Lotus team beat the giant Ferrari in the Constructors, something that would be normalised from the mid-60s until the early 80s. For 1961, Lotus upgraded to the 21, which was even better. Ireland and Clark was the full-time lineup for that year, and both drove well throughout the season, with Ireland even winning the American Grand Prix at Watkins Glen, a track which Lotus would be incredibly successful at over the following 20 years that it was raced in Formula One. Taking the first win for the factory team, as well as Clark scoring podiums in the Netherlands and in France. And then their greatest ever car was made. The Lotus 25, the first fully monocoque chassis in Formula One history. The chassis weighed half as much, and as a result, the car was much stiffer. This was revolutionary, and this was the first major ballbuster in Formula One. The first time that Chapman awoke sleeping giants with his brilliant ingenuity and ideas. Because this man, I mean, if you think about Adrian Newey, right? Think about Colin Chapman, and then remember the fact that he ran the team, as well as was the marketeer of the team, and the guy who basically looked for sponsorships. Now, that I hope I'm not the only one who finds that this is crazy, and this is exactly why I say that Colin Chapman was better than Adrian Newey, because he had to do so much more than just design the car, team's cars, and he observes them. But Chapman was exactly the same. He looked at other teams and found ways to get in front of them, or to use their ideas and make them better to work for his team. And this was the genius of Colin Chapman. The car took 6 poles with Jim Clark in 1962, as well as 3 wins in Belgium, Britain and America. Sadly, Lotus's fragility was noticeable in 1962, as Clark retired 4 times in Monaco, France, Italy and South Africa. He had led in France and South Africa before these retirements, and had Clark won in South Africa, he would have scored 39 points, and Hill, who was now at BRM, would have also scored 39 points, with Clark winning on countback. And this was one of 3 occasions where one result costed Clark and Lotus the title. Sadly, yet again in 1962, Lotus had another fatality. Only this time, it wasn't somebody who actually drove for the factory team. It was a brilliant 20-year-old driver called Ricardo Rodriguez. Now you might recognize that name because the Mexico City track is now named after him and his brother Pedro. And he was a brilliant driver who had the potential to become a world champion with Ferrari. Then Ferrari refused to give him a car, and it was a non-championship event at home in Mexico at the very track that would be named after him many years later. He passed away while driving a Lotus 24 for Rob Walker, and he was, as I said, just 20 years old. His rear right suspension had failed. Now, this incident was different to Alan Stacey's because Stacey had hit a bird, and as a result, he couldn't see and he was knocked out. And, you know, that's not to do with the car, that was just to do with how dangerous Formula One was in general. Then, in 1963, Lotus dominated.
Winner at 97.5 miles an hour is Jim Clark. First man home, Jim Clark. A storm slowed them down and only 5 finished. Man to watch this year, Jim Clark. And Jim Clark does stay there, clocking a lap record on the way. Tony Maggs in 2nd place and Graham Hill in 3rd are still behind when Jim crosses the line. So now Jim's clear favourite for the world title.
As seems inevitable this year, Jim Clark's the first man home. The Flying Scotsman in his Lotus Climax averaged nearly 108 miles an hour for 2 hours and a quarter. His 4th success in a row.
To the race, Jim Clark had lapped the whole field, apart from 2nd-placed Dan Gurney.
Jim Clark won an insane 7 races out of 10, including 4 on the bounce in Belgium, the Netherlands, France, and in Britain. He almost won in Monaco and in Germany, and fell into mechanical trouble at the start of the American Grand Prix. Had things gone to plan, Clark very well could have won every single race that season, and Lotus took their first ever Drivers and Constructors titles. Then 1964 came around. It was a challenge. BRM and Ferrari had designed cars that could compete with Lotus. Tony Rudd designed the P261 for BRM, and young Italian engineer Mauro Forghieri, who actually later worked with Lotus in the 1990s as he was in charge of designing Lamborghini's engine for them, created the 158. Both were monocoque. They only created these 2 years after Chapman made the monocoque chassis. Chapman was playing 4D chess while everyone else was playing backgammon, basically. And BRM and Ferrari both had very strong driver lineups, with Graham Hill and Richie Ginther driving for BRM, and Lorenzo Bandini and Surtees driving for Ferrari. Clark looked set to have another great season, winning 3 of the first 5 races, and he could have won again in Monaco, and in France, he retired as well. And after the British Grand Prix, it was Clark in first on 30 points, Hill in second on 26, and then Richie Ginther, Peter Arundel, and Jack Brabham in third, fourth and fifth, all on 11 points. Mid-season, Lotus changed from the 25 to the brand new 33, which was another great car which we will get into later. It was slightly quicker at the time, but it was still in its infancy, being developed by Clark and Chapman throughout the year. Clark had an insane ability to be able to pick up on the slightest of problems with the cars and be able to find solutions. This was something he passed down to his protege Jackie Stewart. Why did I say Jackie? I was in my French voice there. To his protege Jackie Stewart, who would later be a thorn in the side of Lotus and Chapman. The second half of the season was, for lack of a better phrase, a disaster for Clark and Lotus. Hill and BRM struggled too. Poor reliability came for both. Meanwhile, Ferrari were coming up the side very quickly, winning 3 races in a row with Surtees and Bandini even won in the older 156 in Austria. Ferrari had arrived. After the Italian Grand Prix, it was mainly a 3-way fight for the title, with Hill on 32 points, Clark on 30, and Surtees on. In the battle of the second drivers, Ginther, Bandini and Mike Spence and Peter Arundel were dueling for 4th in the standings. Mike, Spence and Arundel had both driven for Lotus, and after Italy scored a combined 12 points, with Ginther on 20 and Bandini on 19. The Constructors was tight, with Ferrari on 37 points with a second, a ninth, a third and 3 wins, BRM on 36 points with 1 win, 4 second places and a fourth, and Lotus on 35 points, a third, 3 wins, 4th and 6th. The point system was very strange though, and I'll get into that right now. Only the best 6 results for a driver counted, although none of them had point deductions because Hill had 6 finishes, Clark had only 4 results, and Surtees finally had 4 finishes as well. As for the Constructors, only the best result for the team per race counted, and only their best 6 results counted as well. For example, BRM finished 1-2 in Monaco, with Hill winning and Ginther being second, but only Hill's points actually counted towards the championship. So BRM lost 2 4th places, Ferrari lost nothing as they only had 5 points finishes with a second, a third and 3 wins, and Lotus lost nothing as they had 3 wins, a third, a fourth and a 6th. So Lotus had 6 results, Ferrari had 5, and BRM had 8 finishes. BRM were a lot more reliable with both of their drivers than Ferrari and Lotus were, because Ferrari weren't reliable in the first half and Lotus weren't reliable in the second half. So coming up after Monza was the US Grand Prix at Watkins Glen, a track where Clark was the favourite to win at, as he had won, one of the last 2 years, and Lotus had historically been very good at the Glen. They won in 1961 there, and they had also won in 1962. Indeed, Lotus won qualifying with Clark on pole and Spence in 6th, then Ferrari had Surtees in 2nd and Bandini in 8th, with BRM's Hill and Ginther in 4th and a lowly 13th for Ginther. Surtees took the lead from Clark at the start, with Clark dropping back to 4th behind Hill, Spence and Surtees. Clark then took the lead back on lap 13 and led until lap 44, and then Clark's typical bad luck arrived. He had a fuel injection issue and misfired. Now Clark was out. He was put in Spence's car to try and lower the points that BRM, Hill and Ferrari Surtees could get. He was making progress, setting qualifying pace. He almost went exactly as quickly as he did in qualifying on lap 81 before he hit trouble. He retired on lap 102 as the fuel pump had leaked and he ran out of fuel. Surtees and Hill finished 2nd and 1st, and Lotus and Clark needed a miracle to win the Drivers' Championship, and the Constructors was nearly impossible too. So Lotus needed to win, with Ferrari scoring no higher than 3rd. BRM were out of the equation, as their high finishes meant only a win could win the championship. So if Lotus won, BRM simply just couldn't win the Constructors. As for the drivers, Clark needed to win with Surtees 3rd or lower, and Hill lower than 4th. Once again, it started well for Lotus, with Clark on pole, Surtees 4th, and Hill in 6th. In 2nd was Dan Gurney, and I think it was Lorenzo Bandini in 3rd, but I'm not completely sure on that. So, Clark led from Gurney, Hill, Bandini, and Surtees for the opening stages of the race, and it looked to be, oh dear, Lotus have won it again, Things then got better for both Clark and Surtees because Lorenzo Bandini did what I like to call the good old-fashioned Sergio Perez, and Bandini nuked Graham Hill. Bandini nuked into Graham Hill, which damaged his exhaust. So now Hill was running much slower, Surtees was 4th, but even if Bandini let him through into 3rd, Clark would still win the title, and Lotus looked set to win the Constructors. Then, on the penultimate lap of the season, Clark's bad luck came once again, and Clark and Lotus's hopes faded. Clark had dominated the race, but he didn't lap Surtees or Bandini enough times to be ahead. Now Hill could win. Ferrari realised if Bandini, now in 2nd, swapped with Surtees, who was promoted to 3rd, then they would win both titles. Clark had a fuel leak, the same problem that he had had in America. And I gotta tell you, this was the 2nd of 3 races which costed Clark and Lotus a world championship. So, Ferrari ended up winning both titles, and in all the chaos, Dan Gurney won, but nobody really cared. All the chaos now ended with a double for Ferrari, the first since 1961. Surtees had become the 3rd British world champion in as many years, and the 4th in 6 years, as well as the 2nd with Ferrari after Mike Hawthorne in 1958, and as of 2024, he is the final British world champion with Ferrari. Then, 1965 was yet more dominance with the 33.
Jim Clark led from flag to flag. For most of the race, he was shadowed by new teammate Mike Spence. But Spence spun on lap 60 and dropped behind John Surtees and Graham Hill. Jim Clark won the Belgian Grand Prix for the 4th successive year.
It was number 6, Jim Clark, all the way. Nobody could possibly catch him now. Victory for Clark at 89.2 miles per hour. One who can catch Clark. Winner at 99.79 miles an hour.
Winner with a speed of 104 miles an hour, Jim Clark of Lotus.
Winning the race, and with it, the Formula One world title.
Clark and Lotus again dominated, winning 6 out of the 9 races they did, because they missed one race. They missed the Monaco Grand Prix. See, Lotus were not just in F1. They designed 5 IndyCars from 1963 until 1969, after Gurney convinced Colin Chapman to make a rear-engine IndyCar. And this is also crucial because this began the relationship between Lotus and Ford, which lasted over 20 years. Chapman designed these cars with a fella called Len Terry, who had worked for Aston Martin and Gilby. Clark first tried to win the Indy 500 in 1963 as a rookie, and where there was some controversy over who won the race. Eventually, Parnelli Jones was classified as the winner, and this was in the Lotus 29. The 29 was then replaced by the 34, and that was just as quick. Sadly, the Dunlop tyres they had on their cars went kaboom, which led Clark to crash out from the race, which angered Ford quite a lot, because they withdrew the other car. Their patience was then eventually met in 1965. Terry mainly designed the 38, which was incredible. Clark qualified 2nd, and he had the fastest one-lap record of 163.973 miles an hour over one lap. And then AJ Foyt just came and went even quicker. Clark then led lap 74 until the end, barring just 10 laps. lapping all but 4 cars. Meanwhile, Graham Hill was stat padding and won yet another Monaco Grand Prix while Clark and Chapman were in America. But that doesn't matter. Clark dominated the rest of the season with a 33. He won the championship at the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring Nordschleife, a track he had never won at in his career. Lotus won the Constructors at this race too, and Clark took an incredible Grand Slam. Then a regulation change came. The engine displacement was changed from 1.5 litres to 3 litres, which made racing even more dangerous and made the cars quicker. It was a return to what racing was like before World War II, and even at the start of Formula One as a sport. Lotus struggled as a result of this. Clark did take 2 pole positions, but in general it was a very difficult year for them because their engine was smaller in litres as Coventry Climax, their engine suppliers, had quit making engines. They ended up using a heavy BRM engine by the end of the season, but it came too late and it was heavy. Clark did win in the US Grand Prix and finished 6th in the drivers' standings, but Lotus finished just 5th in the Constructors due to their poor performances, which was the worst they had done in a long time. It was in 1966 that Lotus was moved by Chapman to Hetland, Norfolk, where they are still based to this day. During this time, a company called Cosworth was created by Mike Costin and Keith Duckworth. They were buddies with Chapman as they had previously worked with him, and so when the regulation changes came, Chapman had a cheeky wee idea. Cosworth were having success with their engines, and Chapman decided to have a little chat with Ford to see if they could develop the engine. Ford agreed, and the greatest ever engine in Formula One history was created. The dual 4-valve engine. The DFV dominated F1 for 16 years. 1967 was when Lotus Ford Cosworth debuted. It was in the Netherlands. Lotus had abandoned their idea of one strong driver and one backup driver, and elected to bring Graham Hill back to the team. Now Lotus had the only driver title winning combo on the grid with Hill and Clark immediately won with the DFV in round 3 in the Netherlands. In my personal opinion, Clark would have won a 3rd title if they had started the season with the DFV as in South Africa. An engine failure caused him to retire. Plus in Kyalami, they had a problem, and it was a very engine-based circuit. Kyalami was in South Africa. Of his other 3 retirements, 2 were not engine-related, so this leads me to believe he would have had a better chance with the DFV from the very start. He didn't win the title, but he put in some incredible displays, winning in Britain, America, and Mexico. His most impressive ever drive, however, was not a race-winning one. It was one that should have been race-winning, but sadly, it wasn't rewarded. It was the Italian Grand Prix of 1967. Clark came from a lap down. After suffering a puncture, he managed to get his way back up to the lead, and then with just a couple laps left, he had fuel trouble and finished 3rd behind Surtees and Brabham. Plus, a suspension failure as well in Germany cost Jim Clark a 3rd title. It was the 3rd time Lotus had lost a title with Clark in one race, as they were leading in South Africa in 1962 and in Mexico in 1964. Had Clark won these races, he would have gone from a 2-time champion to a 5-time F1 champion if he'd won in Germany. But instead, he was a 2-time champion due to Lotus's risks with such a nimble car. The nimbleness made them quick, but risked the increase of mechanical failure. Sadly, this partially caused 2 deaths in 1968. Clark and Hill finished 1-2 in South Africa in the maiden race of 1968. Clark was the favourite to win the World Championship that year. There was a 4-month break between South Africa and Spain, and so drivers chose to do other events during this time. Clark, Hill, Jean-Pierre Beltois, Henri Pescarolo, Derek Bell, Piers Courage, and Chris Amon had all entered into an F2 race at Hockenheim, which was surrounded by fir trees. Clark also could have raced the BOAC 1000 kilometers at Brands Hatch, but chose to do the event of Hockenheim because of obligations with Firestone. This was darkly ironic considering what happened to Clark. Clark was struggling before the race as he couldn't get any heat into the tyres, and then, on lap 5, tragedy struck.
It was in the 5th lap that something went wrong. Clark's car had not reappeared in front of the timekeeper. The reason was soon clear. Clark had careered off the track at over 150 miles an hour. A stunned Graham Hill searched among the wreckage for a clue to the inexplicable crash. Clark had been killed instantly as his car smashed through the trees bordering the track. Like Hill, Colin Chapman and the rest of the Lotus team, the world mourns the loss of a likeable man who was also one of the greatest Grand Prix drivers of all time.
In what is suspected even now to be a mechanical failure, most likely tyre related, Clark's Lotus veered off and crashed into the trees. Chapman, Hill, Surtees, Eamon, Stewart, Gurney and Jack Brabham, all legendary figures in the sport, mourned Clark's death. Chapman was publicly devastated, stating he had lost his best friend. And then, just a month later, things got even worse. After Clark died, Mike Spence was invited back to Lotus and took part in a test at Indianapolis ahead of the Indy 500. Chapman got asked by the CEO of STP, who were Lotus's sponsors, if Spence could drive the turbo car for a bit due to Greg Weld, who was their test driver, not being able to get the car up to speed. Spence had a one-lap speed of 163 miles an hour on his first lap, which was very good for a first lap and would have put him around the back 2 or 3 rows of the Indy 500, but you did need a 4-lap average at Indianapolis. On his second lap, he hit the wall, and the wheel hit him. Not the steering wheel, one of the wheels in the car. And as we know from Gio Bianchi, Justin Wilson, and Ayrton Senna, an impact like that is very difficult to survive. Spence died that night at 9:45 PM from head injuries, aged just 31. He was born and died in the same year as Clark. In what was an incredible season, Clark's 2 best friends, Hill and Stewart, fought for the World Championship. It was a 4-way fight for the championship in 1968. After the British Grand Prix, it was Hill on 24 points, Ferrari's Jackie Ickx on 20, Matra's Jackie Stewart on 17, and reigning champion Denny Hulme, who had moved from Brabham to McLaren, on 15 points. Ickx gradually dropped off as he scored a 4th in Germany and a 3rd in Italy, but broke his leg in Canada, so he couldn't race in Canada or America, putting him out of the title race. Stewart won in Germany and Hulme won in Italy and Canada, while Hill hadn't won since Monaco in May, which was 4 months previously. Hill needed a result, as Hulme was now tied on points with him, and Stewart was just 6 behind. Hill got a result, finishing 2nd at Watkins Glen behind Stewart, who was now only 3 points behind. Heading into the finale in Mexico, Hill was on 39 points. Wait a sec. We've seen this before, right?
Hey, I've seen this one. This is a classic.
Yep. Like in 1964, Hill was the championship leader on 39 points, heading into the final round, only this time his 2 rivals were on 36 and 33 points, so they were even closer than in 1964. Hill qualified 3rd with Hulme 4th and Stewart 7th. Hill had to win to be guaranteed the title, but there were numerous other ways he could win, as Stewart could finish a position higher than him in any position from 2nd to 4th, so he could finish 2nd and Hill could finish 3rd, Hill could finish 4th and Stewart finish 3rd, etc, etc. And he could even finish in 6th if Stewart finished 4th. Hulme needed a miracle, as he needed Hill to be 4th or lower for him to win, and Stewart had to win or finish at least 1 place ahead of Hulme, or even a position behind if he was 3rd or 4th. He needed Hill to be at least 2 places behind if he was in 2nd and 3rd, and if Hill was 3rd and 4th, Hill would still win the Drivers' Championship. Constructors wise, Lotus needed just a point to win. Hulme was out by lap 10 and Stewart had an engine problem, which meant that Lotus were guaranteed the title. Hill secured the bag in the Constructors as well, winning by 1 minute and 19 seconds from Bruce McLaren in his own car and his new teammate Jackie Oliver. It was such a roller coaster year for Lotus, and for me the only year that could rival this in terms of the roller coasters and how much of an up and down year it was is 1978, which we will get onto later. By the way, if you're still watching this video, hello, like and subscribe please, thank you. From the high of South Africa to the low of April 7th, to another low of May 7th, to the massive high of Mexico. It was around this time that Chapman began revolutionising Formula One further. He and Lotus had just signed a contract with Imperial Tobacco's Gold Leaf, who they remained with until 1972. Then, as previously mentioned, Stewart became a real thorn in the side of Lotus. His car development skills, combined with the management of Ken Tyrrell and the designs of Gérard Ducarouge and later Derek Gardner, and number 2 Francois Sever, was a well-run unit. At this stage it was Matra being ran by Tyrrell. What made it so fast was that it had proper wings, and Stewart was great at fixing issues with the cars.
And now we approach a thing called the Flugplaza. And this Flugplaza is where the first jump of the Nürburgring comes in. Now the car gets light over this little bump, you put it into 5th gear, top gear mark you, going round here. You're accelerating hard, and this is a gamble, whether you change into 4th gear just before here or keep it in 5th, because just here the car takes off and you fly over this. You arrive on the ground again with not much room to start getting the car nicely balanced and sorted out for the start of a very fast section. Fastest part in the circuit with the main straight. You're going through here in 4th or 5th gear, you're climbing, it's quite a climb, so the car's really working hard. You're getting to the top of this rise here. Now, of course, there's been many accidents up here. There was a driver killed here a couple of years ago because you're going down this next section around 175 miles an hour. Doesn't look like it. When you see this here, you think it's a very short straight. This section here is taken at 175 miles an hour. You're in top gear, of course. And you go over this rise, again the car gets light as you go over the rise, it's up in the air, you've got to settle the car down again because the Nürburgring is never level, and you go into this left-hander. Now I take this in top gear, I keep it in top gear, which is 5th gear. Now look at this, a Nürburgring classic. You come out of a semi-dry road condition, straight into a change of surface, and now this surface holds rain, terribly slippy. And here you've got a hard braking corner. You're in 3rd gear. It's faster than you think, in fact. You go through here into what they call the foxhole. The foxhole used to be one of the most dangerous parts of the circuit, and they certainly have cleared it up a lot by putting barrier most of the way down. But again, you achieve your maximum speed on this whole circuit again down this section. And this also is hard to believe. Here you see yourself going through what is really a cutting in a heavily valleyed area with trees. Now, can you think of going down here at 175, where the car bottoms out in the bottom, it graunches the suspension, the chassis really gets gouged, and you start going up this other end here. Now, when you go up this hill, at the bottom here, if you look up the hill here, you're going up here with so much G-forces on that you can't take your foot really properly off the throttle and get it onto the brake.
They took wins in Spain, the Netherlands, France and Britain, as well as a podium in Germany with Stewart, and 3 podiums with Jean-Pierre Beltois, who was then the number 2 driver and was later replaced by Johnny Servoz-Gavan, who was replaced by Francois Sever. Jochen Rindt was signed to be the successor of Clark, something Clark would have most likely agreed with, considering Rindt was a friend of his. Rindt became the more reliable driver compared to Hill, as despite Hill being second in the standings after Monaco, because he won in Monaco again, he only scored a further 2 points finishes in the remaining 7 races he did. But Lotus did have a quick car. The high wings were a huge health risk, however, as both Rindt and Hill had rear wing failures while running at the front in Spain. Rindt injured himself and missed a round, but he had led 20 laps and took the fastest lap, so the pace was there. The car just needed some tweaking. This was evidenced by Rindt taking poles in Spain, the Netherlands, Britain and in Italy, and halfway through the season they found something. And Rindt finished the season strong, taking 3 consecutive podiums in Italy, Canada, and his first Grand Prix win in the USA, and second for Lotus that season. He finished 4th in the driver's standings, come season's end, with Hill in only 7th despite being the reigning champion. Hill broke his leg in the US Grand Prix, and Chapman had had enough of him and demoted him to Rob Walker's team. Lotus finished 3rd in the Constructors behind
Matra and BRM.
1970 was expected to be a very, very close year. Ferrari looked to have improved with Jackie Ickx moving from Brabham to Ferrari. McLaren were close, as were Tyrrell, who were now independent. Matra, who were now independent from Tyrrell. Brabham and Lotus were all close. Any of these teams could win races in the first half of the season. And it was a brilliant season of racing, with 4 drivers winning the first 4 races of the season. Mid-season, Lotus brought in the 72 for Rindt, and to say it dominated would be an understatement. Now, I can kind of explain this a little bit better because I know a bit about what is going to be mentioned here, but the 72 was quick because it had inboard brakes, which meant that the drivers had a better response to braking. It had side-mounted radiators and side pods, which actually hadn't really been used since World War II because they weren't in that position, they were somewhere else. And proper wings, which gave the car more downforce, and it was the sort of wings that you see nowadays in Formula 1, not the really high wings that, well, were very, very, very dangerous. Rindt won 4 races in a row, in the Netherlands where he mourned the death of his friend Pierre's courage, in France, in Britain, and in his birth country of Germany, because of course he was born in Mainz but he was raised in Graz, Austria. He drove brilliantly in Germany with Jackie Ickx for the victory, eventually coming out on top by just 7/10 of a second. They traded the lead many, many times in that race. After Germany, Rindt led the championship by 20 points, meaning he could miss 2 races and still lead the standings. Brabham was second with 25 points, so Rindt was on 45. And then it was Hulme in 3rd with 20 points, Stewart was on 19 points, and Matra's Eamon was on 14. Lotus led the Constructors by 17 points from March, and they had 50 points, with March having 33, Brabham having 29, Ferrari having 16, and McLaren having 27. Retirement in Austria, combined with a 1-2 finish Ferrari with Ickx and rookie Clay Regazzoni, put pressure on Rindt. Then, like with Clark, tragedy struck mid-season. Rindt was practicing for the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. When coming up to the Parabolica, something went wrong with his car. Hulme, who was behind him when he had his accident, said, "Jochen was following me for several laps and slowly catching up, and I didn't go through the second Lesmo corner very quick, so I pulled to the one side and let Jochen pass me. Then I followed him down the Parabolica. We were going very fast, and he waited until the 200 meters, put on the brakes. The car just sort of went to the right and then turned to the left and turned to the right again, and suddenly just went very quickly into the guardrail."
What is so unbelievable about these 2 images provided by Getty Images and Motorsport Images in LET is that these photos were pretty much taken at exactly the same time. On the left, Nina Rindt, waiting for her husband to come back around, only to realise moments later that the sound of ambulances coming was for her own husband. And then, in the other picture, Jochen being carried away. I'd like to preface by saying, I tried to find images where it was just the car, but I couldn't find any. So that's the best I can do. And it's just unbelievable that these photos were taken at nearly exactly the same time. And it shows how life can be snatched away in just a moment. It's believed he had a brake failure, and he hit the barriers. I won't go into the details too much as it's quite brutal, but he died, basically, because of the problems with his seatbelts. Because he wanted to get out of the car in case of a fire. And the belt hit him in a place where you don't want a belt hitting you. He died aged just 28.
He would have started 12th with the time he had. Lotus withdrew from that race, and Regazzoni took a brilliant victory in what was a fantastic rookie season for him, albeit one which wasn't celebrated. The only solace Lotus could take was that Ickx and Brabham did not score any points, meaning Rindt could still be the first ever posthumous F1 champion. He was 20 points ahead of Stewart and Brabham, 22 ahead of Hulme, 24 ahead of Regazzoni, who was having a brilliant rookie campaign, and 26 ahead of Ickx with 3 rounds to go. Stewart, Hulme and Brabham all retired in Canada, but Ickx won with Regazzoni second. They were getting closer and closer to Rindt, but then the US Grand Prix happened, and an incredible drive from Rindt's replacement Emerson Fittipaldi, who stepped up and won Rindt the World Championship with a brilliant victory. Fittipaldi stated, "I took the lead, and going over the finish line, I saw for the first time Colin Chapman jumping and throwing his hat, something I'd seen him do for Jim Clark and Graham Hill and Jochen, and I kept saying to myself, he's doing that for me. I won the race. I won the US Grand Prix. It was unbelievable." Ickx could not catch Rindt. Despite winning in Mexico, the gap was simply too much. The other contenders had performed poorly as well in America. Later in an interview with Motorsport magazine in 2012, Ickx stated in regards to potentially winning the title against Rindt, who is no longer with us, "That was absolutely not what I wanted. Winning the title like that would have been no pleasure." And that really shows the kind of person that Ickx is. A great human being. A standout guy. Lotus also won the Constructors' Championship thanks to Fittipaldi's win in America from Ferrari, as the old system of only the best result per team still existed. Tony Rudd designed an update to 72 which initially struggled. Tyrrell and Stewart had created a demon of a machine which won 6 races. And Lotus had their first season without a Grand Prix victory in any of their cars since 1959. It was their worst season potentially ever at this point, even worse than 1966 because they actually won a race in 1966. Their best result was a second in Austria and 2/3 in France and Britain. They even experimented with a gas turbine car in Italy, but it didn't really go to plan.
What the f is this piece of
In 1972, they signed with another Imperial tobacco brand in John Player Special. This livery became iconic, remaining with them until the late 70s and then again until the late 1980s. Fittipaldi had helped develop the Lotus 72 and now it was much quicker. This showed as Fittipaldi started the season brilliantly. He finished second in South Africa and won in Spain. His main challenge would be the reigning champions Stewart and Tyrrell, who were once again a thorn in Lotus & Co.'s side. After Spain, Fittipaldi was tied on points with Hulme, with Ickx 5 points behind on 10 points. Stewart was on 9 points, and Regazzoni was on 7. Fittipaldi finished third in Monaco with Ickx second, and Stewart fourth, because this was when Jean-Pierre Beltois took his only Grand Prix victory for BRM, because he had now been replaced by Sever at Tyrrell. Stewart then took a few weeks off due to gastritis and missed Belgium because he had a very busy schedule, and now he removed his entries in Can-Am and touring cars to focus on F1. Fittipaldi was now 9 points ahead of Hulme after Belgium, with Ickx 12 points back and Stewart 16 points back. Now that could be really boring and just say, Stewart and Fittipaldi scored the same exact amount of points for the rest of the season. But as I said, that would be boring. Stewart returned and won in France with Fittipaldi second. Then Fittipaldi paid the favour back to Stewart and won ahead of Stewart at his home track in Britain. Hulme and Ickx now faded, as Hulme only scored 6 points and Ickx hadn't scored points since round 4 in Monaco, and it was now round 7. Ickx did win in Germany, which put him slightly back into championship contention, but he wouldn't score again until the final round in America. As for Hulme, he drove pretty well in the final 5 races, scoring 4 podiums, scoring 18 points, which was the same amount as Stewart and Fittipaldi, who scored 2 wins each in Canada and America and Austria and Italy. Fittipaldi and Lotus secured the World Championship in Italy, with Fittipaldi becoming the youngest F1 champion at only 25 years of age. Only Fernando Alonso, Lewis Hamilton, Sebastian Vettel and Max Verstappen have been younger. This achievement was incredible. Lotus had won their 5th Drivers' and Constructors titles. They had more than any other team. Cooper, Ferrari and BRM had 2, and Van Mo, BRM, Matra and Tyrrell had 1 at this stage. 1973 would be even better for the team, as they hired the, as I like to say, underrated, because he is underrated, Ronnie Peterson. This guy finished 2nd in the championship with a March in 1971. He had yet to win a Grand Prix, but he was seen as a talented driver who had the potential to win a Formula One World Championship. Lotus had an incredible lineup. Now, it's time to meet their challengers. In the left corner, Tyrrell had the 006 designed by Derek Gardner with a fierce lineup of Jackie Stewart and protege Francois Sever. Fittipaldi won the opening 2 races, including a home win in Brazil, which gave him the advantage over Stewart in the Drivers' Championship, leading by 8 points. Lotus then had a bit of a problem.
Something's wrong. That's Vettel's problem. Here comes Alonso. This is crucial. Vettel's got a problem and Alonso's through. Vettel has a problem. He's led all the way because he's at prey now to Lewis Hamilton. Suddenly all the else has a problem. The engine seems to have gone. And Vettel, both Red Bulls. Look.
Fittipaldi did well in the first half of the season, but not in the second half. And Pearson did well in the second half, but bad in the first. Meaning, they didn't win the Drivers' Championship with a better car. It was the first time that 2 different combos of driver and team had won the Constructors' title and Drivers' title since 1958, when the Constructors' title was introduced, because that was when Mike Hawthorne won the Drivers' Championship for Ferrari and Van Mo won the Constructors.
Tragically, at the US Grand Prix, Stewart's teammate Francois Sever passed away at just 29 years of age. In his brief Formula One career of 46 Grand Prix, he had taken 1 win, 2 fastest laps, and 13 podiums. He was set to be Tyrrell's team leader, but was replaced by Jody Scheckter and Patrick Depailler following his death.
Stewart retired. It was the end of an era for Tyrrell. Lotus had the end of an era as well. Fittipaldi left to join McLaren, replacing Peter Revson. 1974 was, compared to the previous 2 years of 72 and 73, a disaster. Ickx was lured to be Pearson's teammate, but by now the 72 was outdated. The Tyrrell 007, the McLaren M23 and the Ferrari 312 had all caught up. Peterson was in the title fight, which was a 5-way fight. After the Italian Grand Prix with 2 rounds left, he was on 31 points in 5th. Regazzoni led the championship by 1 point from Tyrrell's Jody Scheckter with 46 points to Schecter's 45. McLaren's Fittipaldi was on 43, Regazzoni's Ferrari teammate Niki Lauda was on 38 points, and Peterson was on 31. Peterson and Lotus needed a miracle to have a chance at the drivers, and they were completely out of the constructors' battle, as they were 23 points behind McLaren with 2 races left. Now this was when you got 9 points for a race win. Peterson was then knocked out of the drivers' championship fight despite finishing 3rd in Canada. And the main reason why Peterson and Niki Lauda weren't closer was because they both had reliability trouble. Peterson retired from 6 races with 1 crash in South Africa. The rest were all mechanical. He finished on 35 points, 20 behind Fittipaldi, who left a sour taste in Lotus's mouth as they saw their former world champion win a title straight after leaving the team. 1975 was even worse, because at least Peterson won a couple races in 1974. They didn't win a single race, they only had 1 podium and 3 other points finishes in 1975. With a 2nd for Ickx in Spain, a 4th in Monaco for Peterson, who had won there the previous year, as well as a 5th in Austria and another 5th in America. So now it's 1976, they hire Mario Andretti because Ickx had left Lotus in mid-1975. Peterson left and joined March, and Gunnar Nilsson, who was a fellow young Swede, came in and replaced him. 1 podium came in the opening part of 1976 with Nilsson in Spain. But the second half of the season was much better with the 77, which was a more modern car. The steering and ride weren't great, and there wasn't much straight line speed, as Andretti called it a dog, but it did suit long tracks, long corners such as Sweden's Anderstorp. Andretti worked hard to develop it, and by the end of the season he had 3 podiums, including a win in Japan, his first in 5 years, which was a record amount of time
between his first and second wins,
as he took his first win with Ferrari in 1971 in South Africa, and his second win in Japan in 1976 with Lotus.
Heading into 1977, Lotus seemed to finally be on an upward trajectory after a few years where they were up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down, as since 1969 they had been very inconsistent. They won the championship in 1970, then had an awful year in 1971, won it again in 72, won the Constructors in 73, took 3 wins in 74, and then 1975 was their worst year ever. But 76 was better, with 4 podiums for Andretti and Nilsson combined, including a win in Japan, as I mentioned. So, heading into 1977, it was a make-or-break year for Lotus.